Since everyone is gathered here, tell your son to go over and change the locks on her apartment." The whisper from my mother Evelyn rang out razor sharp before the candles on my 34th birthday cake were even lit. She had just issued the order to strip away the only fortress I had bought with my own blood after years of serving in Middle Eastern combat zones. My father, Robert, cowardly nodded, his eyes glued to his dinner plate. My younger brother, Marcus, silently stood up, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door. The rest of the family nonchalantly passed around expensive wine, happily celebrating my absolute ruin. I smiled calmly, praising my mother's roast beef, because they had no idea that beneath the parking lot of my building tonight, the shadows weren't the only thing waiting for Marcus. A perfect trap had been set, and the bait was an $85,000 federal conviction, counting down to detonation. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if the story resonates with you. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. 6 weeks earlier, the polished illusion of my family had shattered in the fluorescent aisles of a local pharmacy. My 7-year-old son, Leo, was pressed heavily against my chest, his small body radiating the terrifying damp heat of a severe fever. His fingers clutched the collar of my jacket so tightly that his tiny knuckles had turned white, and his shallow, wheezing breaths left small patches of moisture against my neck. I held him tight with one arm, my other hand swiftly swiping my personal bank card to pay for a simple bottle of children's fever reducer. A sharp, ear-piercing beep cut through the quiet store. The gray screen of the terminal flashed a single humiliating word: declined. I frowned, my military composure kicking in as I dug out a backup card. Another swipe, another hostile beep. The cashier, a young girl with bored, heavily lined eyes, shifted her weight and shot me a look of agonizing pity. Behind me, the impatient shuffling of boots and the low, judgmental whispers of the checkout line began to close in like a physical weight. A woman 2 spots back sighed loudly, adjusting her grocery basket on her hip with deliberate annoyance. I, a first sergeant who adhered to ruthless financial discipline and had managed logistics in active war zones, was forced to frantically scrape together crumpled lint-covered dollar bills from the bottom of my jacket pockets just to buy medicine for my child. Leo pressed his burning forehead deeper into my shoulder, too sick to understand why his mother's hands were shaking. His dry lips parted slightly, and he murmured something about wanting to go home. I counted the crumpled bills twice, slid them across the counter, and carried my son out of that pharmacy without looking back at a single face. In the parking lot, I buckled Leo into his car seat and sat behind the wheel for a full minute, gripping the steering wheel until the leather creaked under my palms. The heat of profound, isolating shame burned my cheeks. I had managed supply convoys through active shelling zones, but I could not buy a $12 bottle of children's medicine in my own country. Later that night, the ragged, uneven sound of Leo's feverish breathing echoed faintly from the bedroom, anchoring me to the suffocating darkness of my living room. I had given him the medicine, tucked his favorite plastic superhero toy under his arm, and sat beside his bed until his small body finally stopped trembling. The counterintelligence instincts hardwired into my bloodstream had fully awakened, demanding answers. I cracked open my laptop and bypassed standard banking portals, logging directly into the federal credit reporting system. The screen flared to life, casting a harsh, blinding glare across the dark walls. There, staring back at me like a fresh, bleeding wound, was a number that stopped my heart. $19,400. That was the glaring, red balance, hovering like a guillotine over the name Sarah Anderson, generated from a labyrinth of illicit credit accounts I had never once authorized. I scrolled through the itemized charges with mounting disbelief. A department store line of credit opened 14 months ago. A furniture financing account from a retailer I had never set foot in. A revolving credit card maxed out at $6,009 at luxury boutiques in neighborhoods I had never visited. Each one bore my name, my social security number, and a signature that looked hauntingly familiar, but had never once been guided by my hand. The shipping addresses on the furniture account led to Evelyn's mansion. The luxury boutique charges included designer handbags and Italian leather shoes in sizes that were not mine. Somebody had been living very well off my ruined credit, while I rationed groceries for my sick child. In that frozen moment, a deeply buried memory detonated in my mind. I was 16 again, standing in the kitchen, watching Evelyn aggressively tear open my first meager paycheck from a summer job, muttering about how much I owed her for the food I ate. I remembered standing there with my hands at my sides, too young and too terrified to object. She had never seen me as a daughter. I was simply an asset to be liquidated. My mind aggressively projected across the city, infiltrating the oak-paneled walls of the Anderson estate. I could vividly see Evelyn draped in a silk robe casually swirling her premium red wine, her bare feet resting on a silk ottoman. To her, stealing her daughter's identity was not a federal felony. It was a mandatory tax. I visualized Chloe in the suburbs nervously twisting her brand-new oversized diamond ring. Her timid silence was the most cowardly form of complicity. And somewhere between them, Marcus was sleeping soundly in the cab of his shiny new pickup truck, parked in the driveway of a house his sister's stolen credit had furnished. The billing addresses for this disgusting mountain of debt pointed straight back to Evelyn's mansion. A violent wave of nausea surged up my throat. The imagined smell of Evelyn's expensive floral perfume was abruptly overpowered by the sharp acidic stench of sour sweat and fear. Kandahar, a freezing night in the desert. The sensory memory hit me so hard, my fingers gripped the edge of the desk. I remembered the gentle smile of an allied logistics officer who had generously shared his dry rations with me by a dim flashlight. We had sat together against the cold wall of a supply depot, and he had told me about his daughter back home, how she was learning to ride a bicycle. By dawn, that same man had sold the exact coordinates of my squad to a local insurgent cell for a stack of dirty cash. The radio went dead at 4 a.m, right before the first mortar round shook the ground beneath my boots. 2 soldiers from my unit never stood up again. The betrayal had cost lives, and the stench of his cowardice was permanently burned into my memory. Sitting in my dark apartment, listening to my sick child breathe, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Evelyn was no different than that logistics officer. She had smiled, eaten at my table, and played the loving mother, all while methodically selling my financial coordinates to fund her delusions of grandeur. The only difference was that the logistics officer had the decency to disappear after his crime. He ran, and we never saw his face again. Evelyn did not run. Evelyn sat across from me every holiday, passing the gravy, kissing my cheek, carving the turkey with the same steady hands that had forged my signature, and asking about her grandson, with the warm, concerned voice of a woman who was simultaneously draining his mother's bank account dry. I did not shed a single tear. My tears had dried up years ago, left behind on a dusty battlefield, where I had to bandage my bleeding comrades under heavy crossfire. Crying was for victims, and I refused to be a casualty in my own home. My fingers began to fly across the keyboard with lethal precision. I did not just look at the numbers. I started mapping the illicit accounts, tracing the financial supply lines exactly as I used to track insurgent safe houses. Every credit line had an origin point, a billing address, a date of activation. I cataloged each one in a secure encrypted folder, cross-referencing the account opening dates with known family events. I locked down my legitimate assets with rapid tactical keystrokes, placing fraud alerts on every credit bureau. Every snort's click of the mouse was a deliberate severance of a blood tie. I observed the glowing screen with cold, detached clarity. The people sitting in that mansion across town had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. From this exact second forward, those who shared my blood had willingly stripped themselves of the title of family. They were no longer family. They were targets that had to be eliminated, and my hunt had officially begun. 4 days after the glowing red numbers on my laptop destroyed my illusion of a family, I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the county records office. The freezing winter wind bit into my cheeks, but I barely felt it. I stood paralyzed on the cold stone steps, staring down at a thin, seemingly fragile piece of paper in my gloved hands. Snorts. It was a full financial power of attorney. The principal listed was Sarah Anderson. The authorized agents were Evelyn and Robert Anderson. I traced my finger over the perfectly swooping ink of my own name, a signature I had never penned. The lettering was confident, practiced with a deliberate flourish on the capital S that was nearly indistinguishable from my own hand. The sheer audacity of the forgery made the paper feel as heavy as a lead vest. This was not just a simple credit card scam. It was a contract stripping away my entire financial lifeline, granting my parents absolute dominion over my assets, my credit, and my future. My eyes scanned down to the bottom of the page, landing on the official notary stamp and the boldly printed date. A phantom chill instantly shot up my arms, mimicking the sensation of freezing plastic IV tubes being threaded into my veins. That date was not random. It was the exact day 7 years ago that my son Leo was born prematurely. The memory violently hijacked my senses. I could hear the frantic beeping of the fetal monitor, the sharp commands of the surgical team, and the terrifying silence before Leo's first tiny strangled cry. While I was lying unconscious in an intensive care unit, machines breathing for me, my body torn and bleeding as doctors fought to keep my tiny 2lb son alive, my family was executing a different kind of operation. I imagine the stark contrast. My mother, Evelyn, dressed in an impeccable designer pantsuit, sipping complimentary coffee in a warm, comfortable notary's office. She was not pacing a hospital waiting room, praying for my survival. She was using my medical incapacitation as the perfect window of opportunity to steal my identity. While I was bleeding and exhausted to the point of being unable to stand, those who shared my blood were busy selling me out. I shifted my focus to the witness signature block directly beneath the notary stamp. The sharp, jagged handwriting belonged to my younger brother, Marcus, the golden child. He had stood in that office, raised his right hand, and boldly lied to a state officer that he had personally witnessed me sign this document. I closed my eyes and pictured the power dynamic in that room. Evelyn undoubtedly orchestrating the entire scene with a silent, commanding glare, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently on the notary's mahogany desk. Marcus shifting his weight, nervously wiping his sweaty palms on his jeans, terrified of crossing our mother, but greedy enough to want the payout she promised him for his perjury. I could see Chloe standing quietly in the corner, her eyes fixed firmly on the floor tiles, pretending she did not hear her husband committing a federal felony. She was probably already calculating how much of the money would go toward her own wish list. Evelyn had commanded the room, and Marcus had cowardly obeyed. The brother I had once defended on the playground, the boy I had chased away bullies, for when he was 9 years old, had looked at my near-fatal hemorrhage as a highly lucrative business transaction. Most victims would have pulled out their phones right there on the icy step, screaming into the receiver, begging their mother for an explanation or crying to their brother about the betrayal. I did not reach for my phone. I carefully folded the power of attorney along its crisp creases, sliding it into a protective plastic sleeve inside my tactical backpack. The shock was entirely gone, replaced by the hyper-focused icy clarity of a soldier entering a free-fire zone. My family believed they had successfully buried a secret 7 years ago, assuming my silence was a sign of permanent submission. They had confused my discipline for weakness. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. Every deployment, every missed holiday, every lonely night in a foreign desert had been repackaged in their minds as an absence they were entitled to exploit. I zipped my bag shut, adjusted the straps over my shoulders, and turned my back on the county records office. I was not going home to cry, and I was not going to the Anderson mansion to demand a meaningless apology. I marched straight toward my car, turning the ignition with a steady hand. My next stop was not a family intervention. It was the regional field office of the FBI. I walked into the regional field office of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, bypassing the reception desk and heading straight for Special Agent Elena Rotova. The sterile room was flooded with the sharp acidic smell of black coffee and fresh printer ink. Stacks of manila folders rose from every surface, and the constant hum of a heavy-duty printer filled the background. Elena was a 42-year-old predator in a tailored charcoal suit, a woman who operated entirely on cold facts and steel evidence rather than emotion. She had spent 15 years dismantling corporate fraud schemes and family-run embezzlement rings. She did not offer me fake sympathy or empty platitudes when I slid the forged power of attorney across her stainless steel desk. She just adjusted her glasses, her hawkish eyes scanning the fraudulent ink with clinical devastating precision. Her index finger tapped twice on the notary stamp, and I watched her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of grounding comfort. I did not need a shoulder to cry on. I needed a tactical ally, and Elena was the ultimate legal executioner. Elena did not blink. She pulled a thick manila folder from her briefcase and dropped it onto the metal desk with a heavy thud. $19,000 is just the prelude, Sergeant. Her voice rang out, devoid of any softening emotion. There's a second mortgage waiting to be dispersed at the regional bank. $85,000. The collateral is your apartment. And they use this power of attorney to legitimize everything. The snort's number hit me like a physical punch to the ribs. 85,000, the value of the apartment I had saved for during 3 consecutive deployments, the one sanctuary I had built for Leo and myself. In my mind, I immediately saw the glossy, fake smile of Arthur Sterling, the regional bank manager. I knew exactly how Evelyn operated. I pictured my mother at one of those pretentious charity galas, wearing her expensive pearls, charming Arthur over champagne. She would stroke his ego playing the wealthy matriarch until he willingly turned a blind eye to the blatant legal holes in the paperwork just to secure his quarterly quota. He was not a victim. Snorts. He was the perfect greedy accomplice for my mother's grand delusion. Elena slid a second document across the desk, a preliminary trace of the mortgage application. Arthur Sterling's signature sat right next to Evelyn's forged version of mine. 2 predators in a handshake. Elena closed the folder, removed her glasses, and rubbed the bridge of her nose. Your mother isn't stupid, Sergeant, she said evenly. She's methodical. She picked a banker hungry enough to skip due diligence, timed the power of attorney to your medical crisis, and distributed just enough money to buy silence from every witness. Elena placed her glasses back on and leveled her gaze at me. That makes this a Raicho pattern case, and that means we don't just freeze the fraud, we dismantle the entire operation. A few days after the FBI meeting, I was establishing a covert defensive perimeter around my apartment when a sharp, definitive knock echoed through my living room. 3 beats precise, dictated by military protocol. I opened the door to find Thomas Vance, a 68-year-old retired master sergeant and my only trusted neighbor, standing on the welcome mat. His silver hair was cropped close, his posture rigid despite his age, and his weathered face carried the permanent alertness of a man who had spent decades in hostile territory. He did not waste time on pleasantries. He walked right in, tossing a crumpled receipt onto my kitchen counter with a license plate number hastily scribbled on the back. A gray sedan been circling your parking lot 3 times this week, Thomas said, his voice dropping into a low, growly rasp of high alert. The driver wasn't looking for a spot. He's measuring. I saw him point a camera taking close-ups of your front door and your lock. The information clicked into place with terrifying speed. Snorts. The license plate belonged to Victor Reed, a sleazy commercial locksmith who moonlighted as a fixer for the wealthy. Evelyn needed the original deed to my apartment to finalize her $85,000 mortgage with Arthur, and she was preparing to break into my home to get it. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, a profound realization washing over me as Thomas calmly poured himself a cup of black coffee from the pot I had brewed that morning. My own mother was hiring low-level criminals to rob me blind, while this rugged veteran, a man bound to me by nothing but a shared uniform and mutual respect, was standing guard over my life without being asked. He had noticed the sedan on his own during his evening walks around the complex. He had written down the plate number, memorized the driver's face, and come straight to my door. Snorts. The contrast was a bitter pill, but also an immense relief. I looked Thomas in the eye and told him to stand down. I wanted Victor Reed to measure the door. I wanted them to think my fortress was vulnerable, utterly unaware that the moment they stuck a key in that lock, they were springing a federal trap. Thomas raised his coffee mug slightly and nodded. He understood the play without needing it, explained. To spring the ultimate trap, I had to maintain my cover. The following evening, I walked right into the lion's den, attending a casual family dinner at the Anderson mansion. As if nothing was wrong, the atmosphere was a suffocating masterclass in fake normally. Evelyn had set the table with her finest china, the polished silver catching the dim light of the dining room chandelier. She laughed too loudly at Robert's mumbled jokes, poured wine too generously, and touched my arm too often. Each gesture a calculated performance of maternal warmth. After dessert, the perfect 5-minute tactical window presented itself. My mother, Evelyn, stepped out onto the chilly balcony to take a phone call, sliding the heavy glass door shut behind her. Through the pane, I could see her gesticulating sharply, likely negotiating final details with Arthur Sterling or the locksmith Victor. In the living room, my father, Robert, was instantly swallowed by his usual cowardice. He sank into his recliner and glued his eyes to a loud, roaring sports broadcast, desperately avoiding any interaction with me. Marcus sat slumped in this kitchen, scrolling through his phone with glazed eyes, completely uninterested in anything that did not directly benefit him. The coast was clear. My counterintelligence training took over, silencing my heartbeat. I moved without a sound into the formal dining room, my eyes sweeping the space for any hidden compartments Evelyn might use to store her financial ammunition. My primary target was the antique glass cabinet in the corner of the room, a heavy piece of mahogany furniture Evelyn prized above all else. The smell of old wood and sickeningly sweet lemon polish hit my nostrils as I carefully pried open the creaking door. I worked fast, my ears hyper-tuned to the muffled cheers of the television in the next room, and the faint rhythmic tapping of Evelyn's heels on the balcony tiles. I ran my hands blindly beneath the folded stacks of expensive silk tablecloths, moving past neatly arranged sets of porcelain serving platters that Evelyn only brought out for Christmas. My fingertips brushed against the coarse, unmistakable texture of thick paper. I pulled it out. It was a heavy yellow manila folder, lying hidden in the dark like a sleeping viper. A surge of pure adrenaline spiked through my veins. I did not need a search warrant to know that whatever was inside this folder was the architectural blueprint of my ruin. I placed it gently on the polished dining table, keeping one eye strictly locked on the balcony door. I flipped the heavy cover open, and the blood in my veins turned to ice. Inside were dozens of loose pages of crisp white paper. Every single page was completely covered top to bottom with my name. Sarah Anderson. Sarah Anderson. Sarah Anderson. It was written in blue ink, black ink, red ballpoint. Some pages had lines of practice running from the top margin all the way to the bottom without stopping, as if Evelyn had sat there for hours, filling every inch of white space with her obsessive repetition. I traced the progression of the handwriting with morbid fascination. On the very first pages, the strokes were clumsy, stiff, and hesitant. The work of an amateur trying to mimic a photograph. The S was blocky, the A lacked confidence, and the loops on the D were inconsistent. But as I flipped deeper into the stack, the handwriting evolved. Snorts. The strokes became fluid, aggressive, and terrifyingly precise. The transition was gradual and methodical. The work of someone who had treated this forgery like a professional skill to be mastered. By the snort's final page, the swooping S and the sharp A were absolutely flawless. If I had not known better, I would have sworn under oath that I had signed that final page myself. This was not a quick forgery scribbled in the back of a panicked bank visit. This was a dedicated choreography of theft that had taken weeks, perhaps months, to perfect. A wave of sheer psychological horror washed over me as the reality of the folder set in. I looked at the plush dining chair directly across from me. I vividly remembered sitting in that exact chair just a few months ago, sharing a pot of chamomile tea with Evelyn, laughing about a television show while Robert read the newspaper. All the while, I had been completely unaware that as soon as I walked out the front door, Evelyn would sit at this very table, pull out her pens, and ruthlessly practice stealing my life. Its snorts wasn't a spontaneous crime of desperation. It was practice. The sheer, unadulterated sociopathy required to smile in your daughter's face, while actively perfecting her forged signature was beyond human comprehension. Evelyn was not a desperate mother making a mistake. She was an apex predator, hunting her own young. I carefully closed the manila folder and slid it back into the dark depths of the cabinet exactly where I found it. I smoothed out the silk tablecloth, repositioned the porcelain platters, and stepped away just as the balcony door handle clicked. Evelyn swept back into the dining room, her cheeks flushed from the cold air, and smiled warmly at me. I smiled back, my resolve hardened into impenetrable steel. The birthday trap was no longer just about justice. It was an extermination. Before I closed the manila folder in Evelyn's dining room, my fingers brushed against a slightly stiffer piece of paper, buried at the very bottom of the stack. I pulled it out, and the lingering, pathetic embers of my family loyalty were instantly extinguished by a tidal wave of maternal rage. It was a formal credit inquiry notification, officially stamped from 5 weeks ago. The bolded name printed across the top was not Sarah Anderson. It was Leo Anderson, my son, a 7-year-old child who had just lost his first baby tooth and still slept clutching a plastic superhero toy. Years ago, my family had patiently waited for me to establish my own independence before they began leeching off my accounts. But now, driven by insatiable greed, they could not even wait for my son to grow up. They were actively preparing to shackle him with a generational curse of fraudulent debt before he could even write his own name. Any trace of inner conflict, any lingering hesitation I held about destroying my own mother, plummeted straight into the abyss. The outrage of a betrayed daughter instantly morphed into the ice-cold calculating machinery of a protective mother. The hunt was no longer personal. It was primal. That final sickening discovery seamlessly merged into my present reality. Fast forward to the week of my 34th birthday. My cramped apartment kitchen had been transformed into an active military war room. The chipped wooden table was covered with printed bank statements, forensic accounting reports, and a growing stack of federal documentation, flagged with color-coded tabs. The staff meeting convened around that table was the strangest alliance of my life. My self-retired Master Sergeant Thomas Vance and FBI Special Agent Elena Rostova. I did not say a word. I simply pulled a copy of Leo's credit report from my tactical bag and slammed it onto the table. Thomas's jaw tightened, his weathered hands curling into fists on the tabletop, his eyes narrowing in pure, unfiltered disgust. He had 2 granddaughters of his own, and the thought of anyone touching their futures made the veins in his thick forearms stand out like steel cables. Evelyn picked up the paper, her hawkish eyes scanning the data. Anyone who works in federal law enforcement knows that targeting a minor's credit is the fastest way to extinguish any possibility of legal leniency. Elena did not hesitate. She immediately pulled out her secure federal phone, dialing her field office, and explicitly ordering her subordinates to staple this new felony charge directly onto the pending search warrants. Any judge who saw a 7-year-old child being used as financial collateral would sign the arrest orders without a second thought. While Elena finalized the paperwork over the phone, she revealed the last missing piece of the financial puzzle. Her forensics team had uncovered a devastating transaction. Exactly 1 week after Marcus swore that fake oath on the power of attorney and $11,000 wire transfer cleared his account, paying off his shiny new pickup truck in full. The sender was Evelyn. It was the literal price of his blood treason. Sitting at the table, I gripped the ceramic handle of my coffee mug so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could vividly picture Marcus right at this exact second. He was probably patting the leather steering wheel of his truck, cranking the radio up, swelling with the fake pride of a successful man who had never earned a single dollar through honest labor. I imagined Chloe sitting in the passenger seat, admiring how the streetlights caught the facets of her blood money diamond ring, completely oblivious that the FBI was currently drafting their federal indictments, their cowardice blended together, forming an invisible toxic poison that silently eroded every moral foundation they claimed to have. Elena hung up the phone. She picked up a metal pen and tapped the tip sharply against the wooden table, instantly breaking my train of thought. She looked me dead in the eye, delivering the strictest rules of engagement for my upcoming birthday dinner. "Whatever happens at that table," Elena commanded, her voice devoid of any warmth, Whatever your mother says, wherever Marcus goes, you let it happen. No warning, no delay, no rescue. She leaned in closer, ensuring I understood the gravity of the operation. Next Wednesday night, you are not a counterintelligence sergeant, and you are not FBI bait. You are just a guest at your own birthday party. The only thing you can do wrong that night is to let emotion interfere with their crime. I met her steely gaze, with a bitter, hollow smile that did not reach my eyes. I've spent 34 years of my life just playing the obedient daughter, sitting silently at the table to be used by them. I replied, my voice dropping to a freezing whisper. Trust me. Thomas leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms, a rare ghost of a grin crossing his face. He had seen that look in a soldier's eyes before. The net was fully woven. All we had to do now was wait for the greedy wolves to step into their own trap. The days counting down to my 34th birthday were a masterclass in psychological performance, and I was forced to play the lead role. My mother, Evelyn, called, relentlessly directing the logistics like a general commanding a battlefield. I stood in my kitchen, my phone resting on speakerphone on the counter, as I rhythmically dragged a heavy fruit knife across a wet, sharpening stone. The metallic grating scrape grounded my focus as her sickeningly sweet artificial voice filled the room. Dinner starts at 6:30, Sarah. Just the family. She cooed clearly, pleased with herself. Everyone gathered under one roof. Oh, and by the way, Friday, your father and I are finishing up some bank business, and after that, the atmosphere in the house will be very relieved. I can feel it. She was practically drunk on the illusion of her own cleverness. I knew exactly what was happening. Arthur Sterling had likely confirmed the federal system was waiting on the original deed to my apartment to clear the $85,000 mortgage on Friday morning. Evelyn was securing an ironclad alibi, ensuring I was trapped across town at my own birthday dinner, while her hired locksmith broke into my home. She had thought of everything except the possibility that her obedient daughter was holding the knife. I set the fruit knife down carefully on the counter. The blade gleamed under the kitchen light, freshly sharpened. I simply responded with a warm, dutiful, "I wouldn't miss it, Mom." Evelyn hummed with satisfaction and hung up. I stared at the dark phone screen. The countdown had begun. On Tuesday afternoon, exactly one day before the birthday dinner, a hesitant shuffling knock sounded at my door. It was a rare, unprecedented visit. I opened the door to find my father, Robert, standing on the welcome mat. He carried a rusty metal toolbox filled with old screws, avoiding my gaze by nervously twisting his faded baseball cap in his trembling hands. He mumbled a pathetic excuse about wanting to fix a squeaky kitchen shelf I had casually complained about back in the spring. The toolbox rattled as his hands shook. I crossed my arms and leaned against the doorframe, physically blocking his entrance. I did not invite him in during the excruciating 2 minutes of forced, awkward small talk about Leo's schooling. His eyes betrayed his true mission. He was not looking at me. His gaze darted obsessively over the doorframe, inspecting the hinges, measuring the gap between the door and the frame before locking onto the gleaming scratched nickel of the brand new deadbolt that Thomas and I had secretly installed just days prior. Robert leaned in closer to the door, his vocal cords vibrating with poorly concealed panic. "Changed to a new lock?" he asked desperately, trying to force a casual tone. I looked down at the man who was supposed to be my protector, the man who should have stood between me and every threat in this world, and felt nothing but the cold absence of respect. My voice came out flat and completely devoid of emotion. "The old lock was rusty, Dad." Robert nodded excessively, a flash of genuine panic crossing his eyes before he swallowed it down. "Being careful is right. You are always a careful kid." He turned around, his shoulders slumped in defeat, and shuffled quickly back to his sedan, the rubber soles of his old boots squeaking against the pavement. I stood behind the living room curtains, watching him pull out his cell phone before he even turned the ignition. His lips were moving fast, his free hand gesturing at the steering wheel. I knew he was dialing Evelyn's command center to frantically report the new deadbolt specifications so Victor the locksmith could adjust his tools. Thomas's curtain twitched open in the apartment across the hall. He had been watching too, The final microscopic shred of respect I held for my father evaporated into the cold air. He was not a victim of Evelyn's tyranny. He was a willing scout for her crimes. By Wednesday evening, the trap was fully set. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, carefully zipping up my best navy blue dress. I applied my makeup with military precision, each stroke a deliberate act of concealment. Foundation to hide the dark circles, mascara to sharpen the eyes that would observe every lie at that table. Lipstick to frame the smile that would convince a narcissist she was winning. I was preparing to walk into that dining room, smile warmly, and cut my favorite lemon cake as if I were the luckiest daughter in the world. Snorts. In a dark corner of my apartment complex's parking lot, the true reality was quietly unfolding. Two unmarked FBI SUVs were pulling into the shadows. Their headlights cut the engines, killing to a silent hum. Special Agent Elena Rotova and Master Sergeant Thomas Vance were sitting in the dark, their eyes trained on my front door, patiently waiting for a foolish locksmith to arrive. Evelyn thought she had orchestrated a brilliant heist. She had no idea she had merely bought front-row tickets to her own execution. The stage was lit, the actors were in place, and I was fully prepared for a bloodless slaughter. At 6:30 on Wednesday evening, I parked my car behind Aunt Ruth's rusting Buick and took one deep, tactical breath before stepping into the oak-paneled Anderson mansion. Warm golden light spilled from the dining room chandelier, casting a long shadow of my mother, Evelyn, as she fussed over gold-rimmed porcelain plates. My 34th birthday dinner had been staged like a Broadway play, and I was the only audience member who knew the script ended in blood. Evelyn opened the front door before I could even knock, wrapping me in a suffocating, crushing embrace. The cloying scent of her expensive floral perfume, mixed with the heavy smell of lemon butter from the kitchen, assaulted my senses. "Happy birthday, my little Sarah." She practically sang, her voice so artificially sweet, it sent a violent shiver down my spine. She cupped my face in her hands, examining me with a performance of maternal adoration, so convincing it could have won an award. The dining table was a psychological minefield. Robert sat at the far end, his head bowed aggressively, scraping the label off his beer bottle, with his thumbnail refusing to look at me. He knew exactly what was happening across town. Marcus was a wreck of nervous energy, his eyes frantically bouncing in a triangle of anxiety between his phone, the wall clock, and Evelyn. He chewed the inside of his cheek raw. Beside him, Chloe gingerly sipped her wine deliberately, keeping her left hand hidden beneath the silk tablecloth so her diamond ring would not catch the light. Aunt Ruth, oblivious to the undercurrent, chatted cheerfully about her garden tomatoes. The absurdity of the evening peaked when Evelyn stood up at the head of the table. She tapped her silver dessert spoon against her crystal wine glass. The sharp, clear chime instantly silenced the room. She surveyed her kingdom with a radiant, arrogant smile, lifting her glass high. "Family snorts is the only thing that lasts forever, the roots and the branches," Evelyn declared, her voice projecting with practiced theatricality. "I am so proud of our Sarah, a strong female soldier. But you must always remember everything you have today. Sarah comes entirely from this family." I looked straight into her predatory eyes, slowly lifting my own glass of blood-red wine and draining it. "If you were an uninvited guest looking through the window, you would see a picture-perfect family celebrating a beautiful daughter." But I knew exactly what that toast meant. She was gloating. She was publicly stamping her ownership over my life. She was celebrating the fact that she had successfully chained me to this table, while her hired criminal was picking my lock across town. As the bitter wine burned my throat, my mind locked onto the unmarked FBI SUVs sitting in the dark parking lot, the red recording light of a federal body camera blinking silently in the cold. The party had finally begun. The heavy silence in the dining room was briefly broken when Aunt Ruth carried out a massive 3-tiered lemon cake. As the candles flickered, illuminating the innocent faces of my young cousins, the arrogance of the wicked reached its absolute zenith. Evelyn leaned slightly toward Robert. She tried to drop her voice, but my military-trained hearing caught every single deadly syllable. "Since everyone is gathered here, tell your son to go over and change the locks on her apartment. Arthur needs the original deed tomorrow." The machinery of complicity engaged in less than 10 seconds. Robert swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with cowardice. He nodded once, reaching under the table to tap Marcus's knee. Like a programmed drone, Marcus bolted upright. He pressed his phone to his ear, faking an emergency call from a construction site, and grabbed his jacket. "Yeah, boss. I'll be right there," he muttered into the dead phone, avoiding my gaze. He dug the stolen keys out of his pocket and practically sprinted for the front door. Seconds later, the blinding high-beam headlights of his expensive pickup truck, the truck paid for with my stolen credit, slashed across the dark lawn as he sped off toward Kettering. The next 61 minutes constituted the longest, most brutal shift of my entire counterintelligence career. I sat at that table calmly cutting slices of lemon cake, eating every bite, and praising my mother's baking skills while actively monitoring a target who had no idea he was walking into a federal death trap. Evelyn chirped endlessly about the future, bragging to Aunt Ruth about the new financial beginning arriving on Friday. She practically glowed with the satisfaction of a woman who believed she had won the ultimate game. I maintained my cover without a single crack, passing plates, refilling wine glasses, laughing at Robert's forced jokes. Chloe excused herself to the bathroom twice, her face growing paler each time. Robert drank steadily, mechanically, his beer bottle never leaving his grip. But in my mind, I was watching the real timeline unfold on a parallel screen. 20 snorts minutes in, Marcus was pulling into my complex, his expensive truck crawling past the darkened FBI vehicles without a second glance, his arrogance blinding him to the two agents sitting 20 feet away. 35 minutes in, Victor Reed was arriving in his gray sedan, unloading a duffel bag of locksmith tools from his trunk. 40 minutes, Victor was kneeling before my door, laying out his tools on the cold concrete, inserting a tension wrench into the new nickel deadbolt. And snorts right at the moment the drill bit breached. The lock, the floodlights of the FBI vehicles would snap on, blinding them both. Elena Rotova would step out of the shadows in her tailored suit, her federal sidearm drawn, and calmly read Victor Reed his rights, while Thomas watched from the adjacent doorway, with his arms crossed, his silver hair catching the blue strobe lights. 55 minutes. Elena was stepping forward, badge out, barking federal commands. Victor's tools were being photographed as evidence. Marcus was standing frozen beside his truck, watching his accomplice get handcuffed under the flickering parking lot lights. The reality of a federal felony charge sinking into his thick skull for the very first time. 61 minutes. Marcus was speeding back toward the mansion, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles, his mind racing through every excuse he could fabricate. I took another slow bite of lemon cake, complimented the frosting, and smiled warmly across the table at my mother. Evelyn beamed back at me, completely convinced her scheme was unfolding perfectly. She had no idea her empire had exactly 0 minutes left to live. The suffocating silence of the birthday dinner was violently torn apart by the screech of heavy truck tires skidding onto the pavement outside. The jarring headlights flashed erratically across the dining room curtains. Seconds later, the heavy solid oak front door was shoved open with such chaotic force that the decorative floral wreath detached and hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. Marcus charged into the dining room like a man running from an active shooter. He was panting heavily, his expensive jacket half off his shoulders, his face completely drained of blood and sweat pouring down his forehead. He stumbled forward, crashing into the edge of the dining table, rattling every plate and glass, and practically collapsed to his knees beside Evelyn's chair. Snorts. His vocal cords were so tight with pure terror that his voice cracked into a frantic, hysterical whisper that echoed off the high ceiling. "Mom, there are police at her building. They caught Victor red-handed. They have a search warrant. Mom, there's a federal agent. They knew my name the second I stepped out of the truck. They know all about the $85,000 loan on Friday." The entire dining room plunged into an absolute breathless vacuum. Aunt Ruth's hand froze midair, a piece of lemon cake sliding off her fork and splattering onto her porcelain plate. Her mouth hung open, her eyes darting between Evelyn and me as decades of blind loyalty to her sister began to crack. My father, Robert, turned an ashen shade of gray, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edges of the silk tablecloth like a drowning man clutching a life raft. The beer bottles slipped from his other hand and rolled across the table, leaving a trail of foam. Across the table, Chloe curled into herself, her shoulders shaking violently as she pressed herself into the corner of her chair like a rat trapped in an alleyway. The bill for her diamond ring had finally come due, and Evelyn, the radiant, arrogant smile of the untouchable matriarch, physically cracked, melting off her face layer by layer to reveal the terrified, calculating predator underneath. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. For the first time in her life, the great Evelyn Anderson had no script. As if on cue to answer her unspoken panic, Robert's cell phone began to ring. The caller ID flashed brightly on the table. Arthur Sterling, the regional bank headquarters. The federal system had officially frozen the $85,000 loan. Robert was too paralyzed by fear to answer it. The shrill mechanical ringing echoed endlessly in the silent room, sounding the death knell of Evelyn's fake empire. Evelyn did not look at her trembling husband. She did not look down at her golden child weeping on the floor. Her neck snapped aggressively toward me. I was the only person in the room who had not moved an inch, sitting perfectly upright with my hands folded neatly in my lap. She instantly realized I had orchestrated the entire slaughter. Instead of surrendering, her narcissism triggered a violent explosion. She shoved her heavy wooden chair back so hard it screeched against the floorboards and stood up, her face twisting into a mask of pure demonic rage. "What the hell did you do?" she screamed, her voice cracking under the immense strain of her collapsing ego. "You called the federal police to arrest your own family. Everything I did was for this house. You are an ungrateful traitor. Everything you have comes from this house." She was deploying her ultimate weapon, loud, aggressive victimhood, desperately trying to gaslight me in front of the entire extended family, hoping the sheer volume of her guilt trip would force me into submission. Her manicured finger jabbed the air toward my face. The veins in her neck bulged. Spittle flew from her lips. She swept her arm across the table, knocking over a wine glass that shattered against the polished wood, sending a river of dark red liquid across the white tablecloth like a bleeding wound. The performance was flawless. The exact same routine she had used to silence me for 34 years. The same volume, the same guilt, the same violent redirection of blame onto the person she had wronged. But tonight, the audience had changed. Aunt Ruth was staring at her sister with the dawning horror of a woman who had spent decades believing a carefully constructed lie. The young cousins huddled together at the far end of the table, their birthday party hats still crooked on their heads, their wide eyes filling with tears they did not understand. I did not yell. I did not need to match her hysteria. I simply uncrossed my legs, locked my eyes directly onto hers, and deployed the cold, clinical interrogation voice I had used on enemy combatants in Kandahar. I leaned forward slightly, letting the deadly weight of the silence stretch out for 3 agonizing seconds before I delivered the final psychological decapitation. "You're right, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, resonant whisper that cut through her, screaming like a scalpel. Even the massive debts were generously bestowed upon me by this family. The absolute lack of emotion in my delivery hit her harder than a physical blow. There was no argument for her to win, no emotional reaction for her to feed on. Her mouth opened and closed twice without producing a sound. I had completely stripped her of her power. The queen was dead, and she was standing right in the middle of her own burning castle. Evelyn was gasping for air, choking on the reality of her shattered facade. Desperate to save herself, she immediately attempted to deflect the blame onto the weakest target in the room. "Your father manages all the paperwork and accounts. Go ask him," she shrieked, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at Robert. I stared at the pathetic display of cowardice, watching a 40-year marriage disintegrate into mutual betrayal in real time. I slowly opened my tactical bag. I did not pull out a massive binder of evidence. I simply withdrew a single thin piece of paper and slapped it down right in the middle of the dining table, next to the Halaton lemon cake. The sharp crack of paper hitting wood silenced every remaining whisper in the room. "That is a credit inquiry report from 5 weeks ago. I stated, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. Opened under the name of Leo Anderson, a 7-year-old child. Pass it around and admire the depravity of this family. Aunt Ruth picked up the paper, her hands trembling violently as she read the name at the top. She looked at Evelyn in sheer horror, her lips forming the word "no" over and over without sound. The undeniable proof finally broke my father. Robert slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, refusing to look up. "She's right," he whispered the admission, draining the last bit of life from his body. The enabler had finally run out of walls to hide behind. Marcus, completely broken by the reality of his impending arrest, began sobbing hysterically on the hardwood floor like a child. His hands clawed at the polished wood, his body heaving with each desperate gasp. I looked down at him with absolute unadulterated disgust. $11,000 for a truck in exchange for a signature selling out your own sister. Huh, Marcus? I asked coldly. You want to know what that money bought? Go ask my son's future. He could not look at me. His forehead pressed against the floor, and his sobbing dissolved into incoherent mumbling. Snorts backed into a corner with no allies left. Evelyn played her final toxic trump card. The authoritarian matriarchal power she had used to crush this family for 40 years. She jutted her chin out, her eyes bloodshot and wide. I am your mother, she snarled. This is my house, and we are family. Family doesn't need to ask anyone for permission. I did not flinch. I calmly stood up, pushed my chair in with deliberate precision, and slid my navy blue coat over my shoulders, delivering the final fatal blow of the night. You need it now, I replied, turning my back on her for the last time. That permission slip is called a federal search warrant. I picked up the box containing the rest of my lemon cake and walked out the front door, leaving an empire burning to ashes behind me. I did not look back at the sound of Evelyn's screaming frantically for a lawyer, or Chloe crying in the corner, or Robert's defeated sighs. None of it belonged to me anymore. The cool night air hit my face as I crossed the lawn, and I took the first full breath I had taken in 6 weeks. The justice system moved swiftly over the next 2 weeks. Evelyn was indicted on multiple federal charges of identity theft and wire fraud. Robert was charged with concealment of a felony. Marcus, true to his cowardly nature, confessed to everything from the fake notary visit to the locksmith plot in a desperate bid for a plea deal. Chloe filed for separation 3 days after the indictment. The $85 Susan loan was permanently canceled, and Arthur Sterling was immediately fired. His office sealed by federal investigators conducting a massive banking fraud investigation. Victor Reed pleaded guilty within a week, rolling over on every detail Evelyn had paid him to execute. The Anderson mansion, once the gleaming command center of a narcissistic empire, was placed under a federal asset lien. Evelyn's charity gala invitations dried up overnight. The women who had once competed for a seat at her table now crossed the street to avoid her. The great matriarch was finally exposed for what she had always been, a common thief in designer pearls. By October, my world had shrunk down to the quiet, secure perimeter of my apartment complex, and that was exactly how I wanted it. Thomas still knocked every evening, 3 beats. We drank coffee on my porch and talked about nothing and everything. Leo started 2nd grade with a clean credit report and a new superhero lunchbox. I sat at my desk one evening, looking at a small framed document resting next to my computer. It was not a court order or a bank statement. It was an old savings passbook that had belonged to my grandmother, Margaret. She had opened it for me the week I was born, depositing $20 from her Social Security check every month until the day she passed. I kept it framed, not for the money, but for her signature on the bottom line, a genuine, authentic signature she had left as a final protective blessing for me before she died. Her handwriting was shaky, imperfect, and unmistakably real. It bore no resemblance to Evelyn's practiced predatory forgeries. It was the handwriting of a woman whose hands trembled from age, but whose intentions never wavered. $20 a month, every month, without fail, without asking for a single thing in return. That passbook was worth more than every stolen credit line, every forged document, and every lie that had ever been told under the Anderson roof combined. I used to believe that family love meant closing your eyes, handing over the keys to your life, and praying they did not stab you in the back. Now I know the truth. Real, authentic love is the only thing in this world that never requires practicing a forged signature. This journey taught me that true peace sometimes requires walking away from the people you once loved the most. If my story brought you strength, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to draw a hard line to protect your own peace? Share your story in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next.